Welcome to the ACT podcast. As usual, I'm Lizzie Harewood, and today we are thinking about the role of the independent sector in education. And I'm going to call this podcast today More in Common. Joining me is Alistair Reid, who works for the Independent Schools Christian Alliance, or TISCA for short. And that was formed, apparently, I was doing a bit of research, in 1995 with an intention to adopt an outward-looking and proactive role, providing intelligent evangelical Christian voice within the independent sector, apparently. This is what I found on your website, Alistair. So welcome to the podcast.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much.
Is that true? Is that how you would describe TISCA?
Yes, I gather its origins, originally it was called the Wadhurst Fellowship after a school down in the southeast, and it was a group of head teachers, and I think they were formed initially in the 1980s because of growing secular pressure in education generally, and keen evangelical Christian head teachers wanted to get together for encouragement, support and advice. But out of it, I think it became obvious after a while, whereas the grouping was mostly in the southeast of England, it became evident that actually there was a much wider group of evangelical Christian, of course, in schools that would benefit from the fellowship. And so it was formally established in 1995. And, we've just been blessed. We've had our 30th anniversary, managed to visit over 30 schools, which was great to do. Bit of a charge round at some points. But you're right. The idea really is that it's a network. It's a group for fellowship. And we're less of a pressure group, more of a support network, I would say. I'm intending, we hope to be obviously prayerful, encouraging, to link to resources where we have good links, and to try and provide advice where it's evident and possible. But yes, networking primarily, support, encouragement and prayer.
Sure. So Alistair, then, tell us a little bit about yourself. What qualifies you to work with TISCA and to work with head teachers and independent schools?
Well, the Lord has qualified me to do it, I believe, obviously, but I came to know the Lord through the work of independent schools. I am from a non-Christian home. Parents worked overseas. I went to boarding school in Scotland, and it was actually in the blessing of God that I went to a prep school with a keen Christian head and his wife, and they, in a very gentle way, introduced me to the gospel. I went to Christian camps. I went on to my senior school also in Scotland, where I had some very supportive chaplains. And I then went into teaching myself after university, and always with that understanding about how important it is for Christian teachers, wherever they can, to just be winsome and to share the gospel. I've been very privileged to be in various leadership roles in the independent sector, primarily in boarding schools, but also a couple of day schools. I've been a house parent, been a head of department, history is my subject, but I've served overseas, Hebron School in India as principal of the school, and I've also been a head teacher of a school in Hampshire as well, all in the independent sector. And throughout my time, actually, I've had links with TISCA, particularly from, in fact, 1995, when it began. I went to Dean Close School as deputy head, and the then head, Christopher Bacon, was one of the founders of TISCA, and he got me involved as a deputy head then in supporting meetings. So I've known about the organisation, I've benefited from it, and now as a retired head and in semi-retirement as the General Secretary of TISCA, I'm endeavouring to give back, as it were, in any way I can.
Fantastic. Well, you certainly are very well qualified. So interestingly, you spoke about how at the time, perhaps the zeitgeist, there was more of a secularizing push within education, and TISCA was created to be that sort of proactive Christian voice. How would you describe TISCA's purpose today? Is there still an element of secularizing kind of momentum, or is there perhaps more an adoption of Christian ethos in some of the schools that you work with?
There's definitely secular pressures. There's certainly in some of the schools we work with, we have links with about 120 schools, mostly in the UK, some overseas. And we're often finding ourselves on the phone or visiting in person a head
Mhm.
teacher, but quite often a chaplain, where they're finding their role is being squeezed, or the message that they're delivering, and sometimes difficult to understand. There's a chaplain who may be a pastor as well. They've been trained perhaps in the Church of England or an independent church. The role that they're undertaking in sharing the gospel, that's being challenged. Now, it's not happening all the time, but it's happening some of the time. And I suppose our role is often to get alongside, to encourage, to maybe link to others who've gone through similar situations, and to link to resources. Because as I mentioned earlier, we feel we're very much here to network. So it's to say to a head teacher who may be head of a school with an historic Christian background, but where there are few Christians perhaps around that person in leadership, maybe one or two governors are there, but it's to actually say, look, you're not alone. And how can we help? They'll often share things for prayer. They may even share some practical things where they're looking for some advice, and we can say, well, there's a head teacher in such and such a school. Can we link you up? And that's what we try and do, be the sort of middle person, if you like.
Sure.
So yes, there's certainly very much a work to do today, as there was back in the 1980s.
Absolutely. So for a moment, let's just roll back a bit, because many of our listeners will probably be involved in education in some way. And most of those, I imagine, will be involved in the state sector. So for them, it may be perhaps a little alien to be thinking of chaplains and boarding houses, being a boarding parent. Now, I've got a little bit of experience of this because I did work in an independent boarding school for a couple of years, and then I spent the majority of my career in state schools in a
Yeah.
variety of different contexts. But what would you say then is the role of a chaplain in most boarding schools? And how is that different from, say, just a vicar coming in to do an assembly every now and again?
Mm. Mm. I think both have got an amazing opportunity, hopefully,
Yeah,
and both are
absolutely.
very valid. Often the chaplain, particularly in a boarding setup, will live on site, may be involved actually as a boarding house parent, but not always. They're there not only for the children, but they're there obviously for staff and for sometimes for parents. And I remember visiting a chaplain, a single person, not married himself, but called into chaplaincy of a school in Scotland. And I remember turning up, and he'd been absolutely thrilled that we'd come all that way, as it were.
Mhm.
But I think what it encouraged him particularly was he wanted to be able to share the fact that although some of his friends had sort of called into question why was he going into this relatively small boarding school of 400 children when he could be in a parish, he could be visiting all kinds of people, and he wanted to say, and he said this to us with, as it were, tears in his eyes, he was the pastor not just to the 400 children but also to all the staff who lived on site, to many of the parents, who some of whom came to the chapel services. So he said, actually, I'm ministering here to maybe 700 or 800 people, and it was a wonderful privilege. So
Sure.
yeah, I mean, the chaplain will also often teach a subject. I'm thinking of one at a school in the southeast of London. He's involved as an outward education teacher. I know he coaches sport, but then he's sort of rushing off the sports field and getting into other clothes to be in the chapel, or even to go in to help with the Christian Union. So, they are fully involved. Parish priests could often do some of that. I know of at least one school in the west of our region where he's employed partly by the school and is also the parish priest. So he's sort of taking services in the locality, but coming in to help with chapels and Christian unions and doing a little bit of teaching in the school. So, there's a whole mix out there, Lizzie. And of
Yeah.
course, a lot of the schools in our network are day schools, and some of them have chaplains, or they share chaplains, or they do get very much involved with local parishes or local independent churches.
Sure. So it sounds like it's a much more holistic role, one that
Yeah.
is involved in the whole of school life,
Yes.
um, and I suppose commits to that school community, whether it's a day school or a boarding school. And that's certainly what I remember from
Yes.
working at an independent boarding school. The chaplain was just part of the kind of furniture, and he was a great encouragement to us, and his whole family got stuck in as well. I know that's not
Sure.
always the case, but
Yeah.
his whole family was embedded into the school. And I think that you have a particular ministry, don't you, with the chaplains? Because obviously that is such a unique feature, at least in England and Wales, of
Yeah.
the independent sector. Not so much in Scotland, where I know chaplains are more commonplace in state schools.
Yes. Yeah.
But you seek to really encourage, support, develop chaplains, their own kind of discipleship as well as their own training, etc. What do you do with chaplains? You call yourselves, or you have someone who you call the chaplain to chaplains?
Yes, as General Secretary, I'm part-time. We've had until very recently a development officer who's now working in a parish context. And we also have a chaplain who's actually a former school chaplain. He's the rector of a church in Oxford. He's also a college chaplain, but he also gives some time to visit. And I was just on the phone to him just earlier this morning. He's just visited a boarding school at the weekend where he's been speaking in chapel. But yeah, I mean, we feel that the chaplains in our network are, although many of them will be Church of England and therefore have some link, maybe tenuous with a parish or with the diocese, they're often quite isolated as well, because I suspect that, they've been employed by the school and therefore that's their focus. But as I mentioned earlier, a bit like some of the head teachers, some of them can feel quite isolated. They haven't got a lot of other Christian staff around them. And so what we try to do through the network is to link them up. I mean, we have an incredibly buzzy and vibrant WhatsApp group for chaplains. And I kid you not, every day there are maybe 7 or 8 posts going up with people asking for help with a resource. For example, very sadly at the weekend, a chaplain saying that one of the children had died in an accident, and is there some information that she could share? And what about some bereavement material? And we're going to be having a Thanksgiving service. Has somebody got a structure? That kind of thing. As well as I'm taking a trip away. Can anybody help with some of the sort of safeguarding that's needed? And I'm doing a series on Easter, obviously coming up. Has anybody got some particular materials that they found has gone well with a whole range of ages? Because that's one of the things about chaplains. They may be a senior school chaplain, but many of our schools have also got prep schools or primary school links. And so the chaplain's having to be active at different ages. And one of the things we've noticed in recent years is many chaplains taking on gap year assistants. Now, they may be post-school, most often post-university, and there might be people considering chaplaincy or going into teaching. And we do run a conference for them every 18 months. It's coming up in March this year, a three-day residential conference. And that's a great opportunity to get a number of teachers in, but also for the fellowship to encourage as well. So, and a weekly prayer meeting for them online on a Monday evening. And that's also something that we do as part of the networking and the strengthening of the chaplaincy.
That's fantastic. It sounds like you've really found your kind of niche and where you are needed. That sounds like
we think
I know it's
so.
not your only kind of role and your only mission, but that sounds like a really important thing that you can be doing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we do work with heads, we do work with governors, we work with Christian teachers. I think it's also worth just saying, Lizzie, that we also work with a few chaplains in the maintained sector, particularly with academies. And we've had 4 or 5 academies join our network of late. And I think they both give a lot. One I can think of in particular gives a tremendous amount of advice and help, not least with prayer spaces, which is then shared across the independent sector from the maintained sector. So that's been a fairly recent, but a very beneficial development. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. And that kind of brings us on to this theme of having more in common, because I think often, particularly in England, we've had this perhaps slightly awkward conversation around, independent education being for the elites and perhaps those that are very wealthy. But actually, what I'm seeing more and more is that collaboration in the Christian world in education is central to our mission, and that we each have our own mission fields, we each have our own part to play. And actually, there are so many opportunities. And I know that from the outset, TISCA has worked closely with other organisations. I know you're a member of the Evangelical Alliance.
Yes.
I think I read that you worked with Scripture Union, and I know obviously
Yes.
you
Yeah.
work with ACT. I'm asking all these questions not because I don't know the answers, because I want everyone else to know.
Yes. Yeah.
So why is collaboration central to your mission, and how are you working with other bodies and perhaps reaching out into the state sector and the maintained sector?
Great. You're right. We have our own, if you like, specialisms and interests, but they're not exclusive. There's so much to share. I mean, as you know, Lizzie, we've been privileged to work with ACT and do a few conferences with you. We link up with Christian Concern, and we're involved with the Education Revolution. We work, as you say, with some state schools directly. And I think often, I mean, a state school often is a lot bigger than some of the schools in the independent sector. And I'm thinking of one in particular down in Kent, where they do a fantastic work every year with prayer spaces. And that is then shared in our network. And I know one independent school in particular that this state school has worked with, where they will go in with a lot of their prayer space material and share it. I think too, we're finding, particularly where resources are concerned, not least when you're talking about PSHE, personal social health education. Obviously, it's known as different things in different parts of the country, but often we're finding in the state sector, chaplains and Christian teachers are using materials that they're sharing into the independent sector that maybe has been overlooked or missed or whatever. And that's part of the what we're doing in the network. Lots of collaboration and lots of opportunity to get involved in conferences together. And yes, as you've said, maybe the traditional picture in the past was, of your independent school child wearing some sort of strange sort of uniform that looked sort of 19th or even 16th century, and there may be still a little bit of that, but by and large, much of that is not there. And most of it is we want to share, we want to be involved where we can to help across all the sectors. And I think too, in the independent sector, we've found there's quite a lot of special educational needs support going on that again is collaboratively being shared mutually with the maintained sector too. So there's lots going on.
Absolutely. And I think many parents who would have perhaps historically not sent their children to private schools have been over the past sort of decade or so, for the reason that they are looking for more intensive support for child with special educational needs. And they have chosen to go down that route. And again, that's a perfectly legitimate route, isn't it? Absolutely. I wonder if we can move on to something that has probably caused head teachers the most amount of strife over the past year or so, and that is the VAT, the removal of the exemption of VAT for private schools that happened last year. I know this is something that has been a real headache, and I'm just wondering what you're hearing. We know, don't we, that there are fewer pupils at private schools. I did hear a figure of around 11,000, and I know that there are head teachers who are really struggling. What would you say from your perspective as someone who speaks to a lot of school leaders? How are you seeing this play out on the ground? What's driving families' decisions to perhaps take their children away?
I think obviously the basic thing that's driving some families to move out is just the cost of living. When you've added that into cost of school fees and so on, they can't manage it any longer. I think what's really tragic in a sense is that whilst some newspapers would focus on your very well-known schools, and surely they can afford it because they got very wealthy parents, and obviously some will have, the vast majority of independent schools are not what many people have in their minds of your sort of top coats and top hats and all the rest of it. They are down to earth, making ends meet as best they can. And the addition of VAT plus some of the other additional costs on schools, the removal of business rates being another one, has really made it very difficult. So what we're finding, obviously, very sadly, some schools have been forced to close. A number are being forced, although it could actually prove to be a benefit, into links with other schools. As I say, that can be beneficial. They get into a group of schools. They share things. Maybe it's the back office, maybe it's admissions they're sharing, maybe it's some sort of, financial structure, and that can be helpful. What isn't always very helpful is that some schools are being forced into profit-making groups where actually, very sadly, the people that own these groups are not really interested in any Christian ethos or any faith ethos for that matter. They're in it for profit. And if the school's not making money, then, the school is sold or the premises are used. So there are all these pressures going on. And I was interested to see the government the other day commending the export of British education overseas. A number of independent schools have overseas branches, and yet, obviously, ironically, encouraging or commending that, they've been slapping VAT on at home. So that is a significant problem. What was an incredible encouragement, if I may say, last week, Lizzie? We hold regional meetings around the country, usually quite small, 10, 20 people from a variety of schools in an area coming together. We had a head teacher come to that, and this relates to what you've just asked me, because this teacher, I'm just going to quote what they said. They said, "Thank you for providing a welcome break and a reset in the daily conversations about income, groups, and pupil numbers. To spend an evening with fellow Christians, to have time to stop and think about the challenges faced by Esther," that had been our Bible focus, "and the encouragements being seen in schools and churches across the country was not what I thought I needed, but was absolutely what I needed." So you're right, there's a lot of pressure on the independent sector, and I think it will go on. And I think, though, we're also finding redundancies in some schools, and we've talked about chaplains a bit. And sadly, this is where a few schools are saying, well, what does the chaplain do? Well, they're only, in inverted commas, taking chapel services and maybe doing a little bit of teaching. Maybe we could look at saving a bit of money by making that role redundant. Well, we've been able to stand up for a couple of chaplains. I have in mind the last year and a bit where they've been threatened with that, and we've stood with them. We've obviously a lot of prayer. We've met with a few people in some circumstances, and thus far, with the couple I have in mind, they have retained their positions. But schools are having to save money, and naturally they're looking to see where that can be done. So yeah, lots happening, a big pressure, but I want to say there's still a lot of encouragement out there, not least from that one I've just read from that head, but seeing, the quiet revival that I know you will have spoken of, and you have in ACT before now. We're seeing that in schools, the growth of Christian unions.
That's really interesting. So we're certainly seeing that. I'm hearing on the ground from ACT members that young people are showing an interest in Christian groups, explorer groups like never before. And kids are asking, please, can we set up something? And in some cases, I know one ACT member said, these kids came and asked me about 3 or 4 times, and I knew that God was prompting me. I just had to set this up. So he was giving me a big enough clue that this was what was mandated of me. So I had to be obedient. I set it up, and there've been kids coming along every week for the past however many months, 6 months, I think it was, really thinking and grappling with these big questions. So that's being mirrored in the independent sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I say we have this very active chaplains WhatsApp group, and they're not sort of boasting, but they're basically saying, help, we need help. Has anyone got resources? And again, as I said, I do go on a lot of visits. Last November I was up in Scotland, and it was just a thrill going into a particular school, a mix of boarding and day. And the lay chaplain there had been in the school a while as a history and politics teacher, now moving more into chaplaincy. He was just so thrilled to be able to share that a year or so ago, there had been, I think, 20 or 25 in their Christian Union group. They call it Scripture Union group in that particular school. And now it's over 60.
Wow.
And he was very much on his own. And this is, where we were saying, how about some links with the local church? And we did have a few local contacts, so we were able to make those evident. But it was a joy, but also a, wow, what an extra pressure on the Christian staff that there are. And some schools have got a number of Christian staff, and that's fabulous, but a number in our network don't. And so it's falling more and more onto the shoulders of one or two. And this is, again, where we started our conversation, links with local churches or with other schools where they can maybe share resources and share individuals is so evident and so important.
Absolutely. Well, we certainly do have more in common.
Yes, we definitely do.
More in common than what divides us. Absolutely. So we're going to kind of think about wrapping up now, but I
Yeah.
really want to just end by drawing attention to the wonderful work you do in equipping chaplains. I know you also do head teachers
Yeah.
meetings where you will hold discussions and have talks, and I think that's one of the things about TISCA that has really helped to enable it to flourish. You have
Mhm.
lots of meetings where people get together over a meal. You've got something quite exciting coming up though that's going to be accessible to a lot more people, not just over a meal, but I think
Mm.
a large scale. So you've got a conference. Can you tell
Yeah.
me more about that?
Yes, as I say, we've got our chaplains conference that's full, which is an encouragement, but that's coming up in March. We really appreciate prayer, beginning of March for that.
Brilliant.
But yes, we have our annual conference, which is in London this year, All Souls, Langham Place.
Oh, fabulous.
It's on Tuesday, the 9th of June. And our title is We Take Faith Seriously, and picking up on the Quiet Revival. And amongst our speakers, we have Rico Tice, we have Rachel Johnson and Thomas Garnier. And it's an all-day conference, but a great time for fellowship as well and sharing lunch together, but an opportunity also to look at this theme of celebrating an increased interest by young people in spiritual things. And yes, please just go on our website, tisca.org.uk, if you're interested and would like to come. It's great to have a large group from a number of schools joining together.
Oh, brilliant. Well, that's excellent. So we're really thrilled to have this great relationship with you, to be one of those collaborators to help you fulfill your mission in your particular arena. And I know I've been very grateful that you've been very supportive of ACT, largely working in the state sector, obviously not exclusively. We do have members in independent education as well, but it's just great to have that friendship and mutual support and collaboration. So thank you so much for that. And thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Lizzie. Bless you.